Hello, and welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your greatest of host, Madelyn.
I'm your all-time host, Emma.
Oh man, I felt like that was a risk. I felt like I was taking a risk there that you might just be like, I'm Emma, and leave me hanging.
Never.
And on this week's side quest, it's a special surprise because I hadn't come up with the topic in time for the main episode last week. We are going to be talking about my pick for our topic of the fortnight. How do we feel about that? Topic of the fortnight? Yeah, it's pretty weak. I agree. It's better than whatever I've been trying to do for the past two.
It's not a deep dive. I refuse.
Instead, for now, it's our conceptual discussion of the fortnight, which this week we're going to be talking about what makes a game deserving of quote-unquote classic status. And along with that, what makes a game one of the greatest of all time? I'm not sure I'm convinced that these two metrics are the same, but there are plenty of reviewers online who do seem to conflate them. So we'll be talking about that in today's episode. So I guess it's my responsibility to do a little bit of intro for this one, since it's quote-unquote my episode. Let's see how many times I can use quote-unquote in this one. Let's play a little Talk This happy hour drinking game here. So I was thinking about this. Why was I thinking about this? I don't know. I must have seen something about... I was thinking about old games... and ones that I know why. Sorry. I took a minute to get my thoughts together there because there are so many things I've been thinking about classic games in the past couple days. So I was thinking about this, basically because of the release of the new Link's Awakening on Switch, which has been a coveted, highly anticipated game, for the other member of Talk This NYC HQ. We still haven't bought it, given that it's $60, and both Clickbait Boyfriend and I are playing like 3 games right now.
Right.
I've been pretty good this summer about saying, no, I'm playing 3 games. I don't have to buy the $60 game now. It's going to come back to bite me this fall when I finally finish some of these games, and suddenly I have 20 games to buy. But that's a sidebar. So I was thinking about it, and I read a list. Somebody put on Twitter their list of, ranking all of the Legend of Zelda games, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was a little bit silly and funny and controversial. And it got me thinking about, what makes a game a classic and what gives it that status. And that's really been hit home this week because all that my games Twitter is talking about is finally the release of the release date for The Last of Us 2.
That in the Untitled Goose Game.
Fair enough. Also, Untitled Goose Game. Untitled Goose Game, an instant classic?
Pretty much. I think so.
Wow. Can we get a mashup of that? Now that they've said in The Last of Us 2 that the whole game is just slaughtering dogs, apparently.
That's not what they said.
That's all. That's my take from Twitter.
No, Malin, the whole of The Last of Us 2 is killing the dog's owners and then watching them be sad about it. Isn't that better?
Can we do a mod that replaces them with the Untitled Goose?
I might have to wait for that before I play The Last of Us. Anyway,
thinking about The Last of Us, which by many metrics could be considered a modern classic, or maybe even just a classic. That's something we maybe should talk about. Mm-hmm. But it's something that I've thought about a lot, because I think in games, it's such a young medium relative to most other forms of art. Right. And there's such different parameters for what makes a game good or great or classic than maybe there would be considered with a novel or a play or even a movie.
Right.
That I think there's a lot to talk about here. Just kidding, there's not. Definite answer. It's just the Wikipedia page that I cite in every single episode of Talk This, which is n.wikipedia.org/wiki/list_of_video_games_considered_the_best.
I'm hope that you got that, listeners, and typed that into your Google as she was saying it, so that you can follow along on this, true list.
I do wonder. I talk about this Wikipedia page a lot, and I do wonder, what how the editors of Wikipedia decide this.
I mean, do they just like something I was considering doing before the episode, before I thought, that's a stupid idea, Emma, that will take way too much time, and you promised you would never do math again in your life. But I was thinking of, going through a bunch of, 100 greatest games of all times and trying to do, a statistical analysis of it, which games turn up the most or whatever. So I wonder if it's a little bit of that. They take all the lists that come out and do sort of where do they turn up and how much do they turn up, and try to make a system of that.
Well, that is what they do. They do explain at the top of the page that the games listed here are included on at least 6 separate best greatest of all time lists, and they say something about how, one list reflects the personal opinion of a writer, but if you've got a bunch of aggregate lists, you can see that they've achieved something approaching critical consensus.
Right.
I don't even really think that's fair. Something that I was having a lot of fun, outrage reading in prepping for this was a couple of years ago, Polygon released a list of the 500 greatest games of all time.
See, I don't even know how you come up with a list like that.
So what they did is they had 20 people. I mean, yeah, I know. How do you rank stuff? They had 20 people make a list, or go through a list of games and rank them, I guess.
I mean, I see that, for movies, the AV clubs did something like that a while ago, where everybody made a ballot of, their top, but it was, top 50 or something. And then they, compiled it into, where did people put things on the list and stuff like that. But I don't see how, going through a list with 20 people and ranking them, 500 of them, means anything at all. What is the substantial difference between 450 and 451 at that point?
There's not, right?
Yeah.
And there were some people in the comments who were trying to get into the statistics of it and why with 20 people, just one person who ranks a game weirdly high, even if everyone else agrees that it's the 450th best game, skews it way off and that they didn't have a big enough data point. And all the comments after that were this is for fun. What is wrong with you?
By Malcolm Gladwell.
Exactly. That being said, there's some weird stuff on this list that makes it weirdly high.
What, for example, if you have one?
Well, I pulled out some games that I was this is good. So, Kingdom Hearts 286. Feels fair. That's the only one on the list, even though I think in the Kingdom Hearts community, although I don't even know that I feel this way, but in the Kingdom Hearts community, I feel like Kingdom Hearts 2 is generally lauded as the best game.
Yeah, I think that's... Or at least the final mix version, as Twitter...
Yeah, floaty combat. Anyway, I checked for The Last of Us. The Last of Us comes in at 177.
Mm-hmm.
Katamari at 85.
How many Zeldas are on there?
There are a lot. There are a lot of Zeldas. There are weirdly, every version of Sid Meier's Civilization makes it on there.
Everybody must have had a different favorite civilization.
Well, it's weird because they say when they're talking about the rules that they eliminate sequels that they feel like are too similar. Yeah. And I believe, of course, and I know that Civilization changes over time, but I was surprised to see frickin' every version of it.
Yeah.
They also eliminated games that had been... This was released in 2017, so they didn't include anything released in 2017. So, thus, saving us from another Breath of the Wild topped list.
Right.
Although, no, because I want to talk about a common first place thing in a minute, but I'll finish my recap of this list first. Pong hits 64, which I have thoughts about.
Yeah, this is a greatest games of all time list.
Right? Pong, Pong, I feel like by any metric, should make it into that classic category. And it's games like
Right.
Pong that make me feel like classic and greatest of all time are overlapping categories, but need to be considered distinctly.
See, I would put Pong under neither of those. I would call Pong historically significant.
Sure. Do you feel like that doesn't, like, classic doesn't encompass that?
I think that it can. I think that classic is something that sort of overarches both greatest and historically significant games.
That's fair.
Like, all three of those are different terms that mean a bunch of different things.
We've created a lovely Venn diagram, basically. Yeah. Other ones, DDR comes in at 53, which I was pleasantly surprised by. I think that's a good slot for Dance Dance Revolution.
Out of a list of 500 games?
I don't know. DDR is a great game.
Maybe if it was like a top 100 list. I don't know why it would be higher on a... It feels like it should be higher on a 100 list than on a 500 list.
Yeah.
But that's just because 500 is like... I don't know. How many games have been made?
Yeah, right? I know. I was like, man, I can't even, like, I'm not aware of 500 games.
No way.
Yeah, DDR just edges out The Witcher 3 A Wild Hunt, which came in at 54. Just beaten by Half-Life, 52. There were some weird ones up top, though. Hang on. Guitar Hero at 44. Just edged out by The Sims. These all uncontroversial, right? Wii Sports, 41. Absolutely. Scrolling by Ocarina of Time. Persona 4 Golden, 33.
Ugh, no.
Do you feel like that's too high?
Yeah.
Frickin' Earthbound hits 29. I have to roll my eyes every time I see Earthbound. I don't know.
I like Mother 3 more than I like Earthbound, which I feel like is also like a cliche opinion, but...
Let's see. Weirdly, FIFA 12 at 22.
Why 12 specifically?
No idea. I guess it adds the manager mode, maybe, is what they seem to say.
But at 22?
Yeah, it's weird, right? Okay,
Yeah.
you want to hear their top 10?
Sure, what's their top 10?
Okay, readers, this is just to give you an idea of what's out there in the critical landscape, and it's going to launch me into a rant, I think. So, number 10, Super Metroid. Number 9, Street Fighter 2. Number 8, Minecraft.
Okay.
Number 7, World of Warcraft.
Okay.
Number 6, Ms. Pac-Man.
Okay.
Number 5, Pokemon Red and Blue.
Sure.
I would not call Pokemon Red and Blue the greatest Pokemon games, though, but whatever. Right? I mean,
it's yellow, but yeah.
Unless
sure.
you have a particular attachment to all of the glitches that are baked into that game. Anyway, 4, Doom.
Okay, sure.
3, The Legend of Zelda. The original.
The original one?
There's other ones all throughout the list. There are like 3 others in the top 100 alone. But yeah, I do feel like
For Legend of Zelda 2, it's like they talk about removing sequels that are too similar. And I know that each Zelda has a different story. But even then, I feel like I would limit myself to like 3 Zeldas.
Well, in a lot of these lists, Ocarina of Time makes the top 10
Right,
or
yeah.
the top 5 or the top 2.
Yeah.
Anyway, number 2, Super Mario Bros. 3, which is also a pretty common top 10 list resident.
Cool.
Can you guess number 1?
Did you skip 2?
2 was Super Mario Bros. 3.
Oh. Didn't you skip a number?
No, 4 was Doom, 3 was Legend of Zelda.
Oh, okay, never mind. 1 is Tetris, I know, because you're gonna rant about it.
So, listeners, I read a lot of these top games of all time, most classic games, 50 best games, 100 best games, 10,000 best games of all time lists. And something that I found fascinating and bizarre is that on a preponderance of those lists, Tetris comes in at number 1. Now, there's some ways to justify this, right? By many, many metrics, Tetris is probably the best-selling game of all time.
Right.
It's depending on who you ask and how you're counting, it's somewhere between 170 million and like 500 million copies of Tetris have been sold. I tend to be convinced by the larger number, right? Tetris is on frickin' everything.
Yeah.
Not to mention the number of people who have played it for free online, right? Without even like downloading the game.
Right.
And Tetris is a fun game, and is a great game, and it is a classic Talk This episode wherein we were literally unable to mash it up, and we learned something about game design and game mechanics in the process.
What were we trying to match that up with?
I don't remember. All I remember is that Tetris does not have enough elements to make a good mashup.
Was it Ratchet and Clank?
That does sound familiar.
No, it was Firewatch, wasn't it?
Oh, that's a nightmare.
I called it something like fire falling from the sky.
Oh, it was fire falling. So I think it must have been Firewatch.
Yeah.
What a nightmare of a mashup.
Yeah.
Why did we do that to ourselves?
It was random. It's true. It's proving to the listeners that our mashups come from RNG.
Like, we never would have picked Tetris and Firewatch, especially that early in our tenure as Talk This hosts.
Yeah.
Polygon talks about it as it's a like the defining puzzle game, and it's totally dominated its genre, right?
Yeah.
Which, all of that, very true. It's just hard for me to say, hey, here's a game that, with the exception of that new Tetris game, right? That the VR one that everybody thinks has like completely changed the game, right? I haven't played it, but it got a lot of good press. I'm willing to give that the benefit of the doubt. But with the exception of that, Tetris has not really changed significantly since it was released in 1984.
What do you mean? It's a battle royale now.
Stop it. And it's just like, really? That's so sad to think that there's been no game that's been made in the past, like, 35 years that could top that.
Yeah.
And I just think it's a lazy, uncontroversial pick.
Yeah.
Although I clearly am trying to make it controversial. But it's at the top of so many lists, right? No matter how much I rant about it, you can say, well, it's the best-selling game of all time. Except, here's what I want to say. No one would ever take that as a rationale for talking about movies, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, what's the best-selling movie of all time? It's Endgame now, right?
Yeah. I think so.
It's Endgame now. For a long time, it was the Avatar monstrosity, right?
Yeah.
Both, like, on different levels and in different ways, fun movies, right? Good movies.
I mean, I would call both Endgame and Avatar, like, historically significant, culturally important.
I agree. And certainly, Endgame in terms of being the culmination of this, like, new style of movie making, this, like, franchising on franchising
Yeah.
that has taken over the industry in the past decade or so, and Avatar being this huge step forward for CGI and that kind of technology. They're definitely events, but I think you would be laughed out of the room if you tried to make a list of the 100 greatest movies of all time and you topped it with one of those.
Yeah.
Well, some people would come in the comments and you didn't put Endgame as the greatest and be like, what about Endgame? You frickin' loser? Spider-Man!
Spider-Man. He's back. Spider-Man.
I know.
It was a fun little excursion that we had, but
yeah.
I mean, as someone who has not watched very many movies in the grand scheme of movies, I would probably put both of those somewhere on the list. But you're right that I would probably not put it at the top of any list.
Right, you would be foolish to not include them somewhere in the bottom half of your top 100, probably.
Right.
Depending on what your category is, right?
Yeah.
Assuming you're going for, like, classic movies, as opposed to maybe greatest of all time, even then, they probably crack the list, right? But because of kind of the classic consideration, which always creeps in some ways. But if you were just basing purely on the quality of the art, Which again, man, I'm just qualifying myself all over the place. It's a little bit silly. Part of what makes something great is the cultural reaction to it and the energy around it and that kind of thing. That being said, if you're making something that's the greatest of all time, I always feel like something that has to go along with that is an objective measure of quality.
Right. Although there is, like, it's not just with games like, oh man, this was emotionally moving. There's some consideration to be found in how fun it was, right? Because that is a pretty important measure, or at least how engaging it is. Let's put it that way. Let's avoid the fun word. How engaging it is.
Oh, absolutely.
As a user. Like, that's a very important consideration when assessing games that doesn't necessarily correlate to any other storytelling medium.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. It's really complicated. I mean, it's really complicated even if you were going to try to make a list of the best novels of all time, right? Where, you're not necessarily dealing too much with technological limitations. That's something that I think also makes it difficult to define a greatest of all time game versus a classic. I did read, where was I reading this? I was reading somewhere in my research that it's interesting that on a lot of these lists of best games or most classic games or what have you, you see a lot of sequels, which is not something you see very frequently, if at all, in any other form of media, right?
Right.
Very rarely does a sequel to a movie surpass the original. Very rarely does a sequel to a novel surpass the original. It happens. I can hear you all now saying, but, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire is my favorite. Fine. Like, that's fine. There are certainly exceptions, but for the most part, most other forms of media see this kind of sequel decay.
Yeah.
Whereas video games, because the technology is changing so fast, games can surpass their predecessors just by virtue of the fact that the developers have more tools at their disposal.
Right.
And they're really able to innovate on what they've already done.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of cases with sequels, too, and I'm not going to pull up any specific examples because this is just kind of occurring to me, so feel free to call me on this. But, like, a lot of times the first game is something of an experiment, and then once you prove that something can do well, suddenly you have more money from your company to do the next one. So even if your list of tools is not necessarily different, you suddenly can hire more people or spend more time on it or whatever. That, all contributes to making a game better.
Right. You have the team to add the online multiplayer. Or whatever. To was a joke.
I don't understand. To be fair, maybe it was great. I never played The Last of Us online multiplayer, but I'm just so confused. It's fine.
Yes, The Last of Us, the defining single-player experience of the PS3 generation. Crippled without its online multiplayer.
I know. It's going to be on 2 discs, though. Did you hear that?
We're really going back to that, aren't we?
Yeah. I mean, people are just making things that are too big before the next generation comes out, apparently.
Fair enough. So I want to pivot a little bit to talking about just ripping apart people's choices.
Sure.
To putting some of the burden on us to actually define, maybe, or pull out some things that might define what makes a game a classic. We'll start with classic, right? We can move to greatest of all time if we want. But I looked at a bunch of people talking about it in various forums and in various op-eds and whatever. And here's a bunch of stuff that I found kind of interesting or repeated throughout. And Emma, feel free to jump in, because I saw you took this note too. So probably one of the most common things I saw was people talking about a game being timeless.
Right.
whatever that means. Am I right?
Yeah. So I saw a lot of people define this as like you could boot it up today and it would still be fun in some way. Of which I was thinking like these people have never tried booting up their favorite old games today. But I feel like that might like there's some overlap with classic there. Like obviously it's a good thing if a game you made 10 years ago can be played today and people still enjoy it and find good things about it.
Right? Oh, wow. A game you made 10 years ago can still be played today.
That's funny. Right. Yeah, I know. Well, we can talk about that later a little bit. But I think that's more of like a greatest thing. And even then it gets complicated because I always hate things that like criticize media for being in the moment, right? Like, oh, it's too tied to today. Nobody will watch it 10 years from now. Like, that's such a lazy way of looking at things.
Definitely.
Especially since I always think it's important that, you know, there's some stories that are at least somewhat aware of the current time period. As opposed to, like, going for universal themes. Sometimes it's important to have of the moment themes.
Well, I think a lot of the time the specific is far more universal than the universal.
Yeah.
Anyway, continue.
Anyway, what I was going to say is, like, there is something good about being able to pick up something that's 10 years ago and still be able to connect to it, right? Like, that's a mark of you've made something pretty damn good. But I don't think to be a classic that necessarily has to be true.
I mean, it's certainly not realistically possible for many games. And gaming, I think, is so difficult because it just changes so fast, like I was talking about. Like, even if you compare it to movies or to television, right? Sure, there's better quality there in a lot of ways now than there was 50 years ago. But the fundamental, other than CGI, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of the fundamental tools have really remained more or less the same. Mm-hmm. This is obviously, I'm not a cinematography expert. I'm sure I'm 100% wrong about this. But if you compare it to you know, if you compare a movie from 20 years ago to a game from 20 years ago, and then compare them to something that came out today, obviously the movie from 20 years ago is going to quote-unquote hold up a lot better than the game.
Like, I've tried, like Final Fantasy VII. I have the original one on my computer. I've tried starting it like 3 times. It's very hard to get into it.
Is that because they're so blocky, or is it because the style is just not the style of today?
I don't think it has to do with the blockiness. It's hard to put my finger on why it is. It just feels a little awkward. I don't know. But it's like, yeah. Or even like, even old games that get remasters. Like, I remember when I wouldn't call Tales of Vesperia a classic necessarily. But like playing that, it was so hard to play because there were no modern like quality of life things. Or even going back to the original Kingdom Hearts. Like, God, is Deep Jungle so frustrating without the strategy guide. Even having played it.
Oh man, you sound like Clippy's boyfriend.
Like 10 times.
He still gets angry sometimes about having to go back into the tent after you've already been in the tent.
Like, it's just such sort of poor level design, and yet you see Kingdom Hearts everywhere on like top 100 lists, specifically the first one a lot of the times. And it's like, you know, it's kind of the maps are kind of poorly made in that game. It's hard to go back to those games, having never played them, having no nostalgia factor in a lot of cases. Mm-hmm. Like, so yeah, that was basically my thought. I don't really know what conclusion to draw from that.
Well, it does make me wonder whether classic ought to be more defined based on response and on nostalgia.
Right.
something that I liked from somebody in the Giant Bomb forum, and to be honest, this kind of just punts the question another layer deeper, but they said, a classic is something that we've decided is part of the canon.
Yeah.
Which, again, that just begs the question, what's the canon? How do we decide something's in the canon, right? So I've mostly just pushed off the question another level. I realize that. But it's interesting. And, it gets us into some philosophy of art questions, right? About, who's the Academy, right? If you're gonna, go on this kind of, museum idea of what makes something art, or in this case, what makes something part of the canon, right? Who gets to decide that?
And even then, you should think about it from a regional perspective, too.
Yeah.
Right? And that's for all media, basically. You could go to France, and they would probably have films that they consider quote-unquote classics that we've never heard of, right? Because
for sure,
they're just not over here. And in video games cases, I guess it's mostly, the West versus Japan. There's differences between what's a classic and what's not a classic.
Mm-hmm.
Dragon Quest is a good
That's
example.
What I was going to say.
Dragon Quest is, the classic of the classics over in Japan, and it just did not catch on here in the same way. So, even then, you're okay, here's the canon of games, but that's the Western canon of games.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe it includes some, games that were not made in the West, but they're ones that were important for the West in terms of video games.
Definitely.
Whereas if you go somewhere else, you might find that certain games didn't catch on at all, or, games that didn't catch on over here are much more important. So even in having a discussion about what classic is, you have to be aware of your own sort of cultural biases.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, another way people try to define it, and a way that an astonishing number of lists pull their stuff together, I assume because it's a very easy way to make a clickbait article, is just by quote-unquote, there I am with my quote-unquotes again, critical consensus, which for many of these kind of not really video games-oriented sites just means the top 25 games on Metacritic.
Right. You'd be surprised how much Metacritic matters. Even in game development, though.
I believe that.
Yeah. It's stupid. Metacritic is so, imprecise in a lot of ways.
Oh, yeah.
But, yeah.
Well, in case you're wondering, listeners, according to Metacritic, the top game of all time is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Number 2 game of all time is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. The
you
PlayStation
heard it here
version.
First, folks.
What?
Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 is the number 2 game in the whole world.
Well, technically it's tied. Technically it's a 4-way tie for number 2 game, tied with Grand Theft Auto 4, Soul Calibur, and Grand Theft Auto 4.
See, that's the other thing, is that Metacritic separates it by system.
Yeah.
So, the Xbox version of a game might get a higher or lower score than the PlayStation version of a game. Whether because of bugs or just because somebody who didn't like it happened to be playing on one system or the other.
Right. There are some relatively recent games that make it onto this sort of top section. Not that many that are that recent, though. The most recent one in the top group here is RDR2. There's also Breath of the Wild. No surprise there.
Yeah.
Let's see. NFL 2K1. That's from 2000, but weirdly gets a 97. Not weirdly. Maybe it was great. I don't know. BioShock, GoldenEye 007. All sorts of stuff. Little Big Planet. The Last of Us doesn't make it until my 3rd screenshot, so, what does that say? But yeah, I realize that Metacritic has a lot of significance in the industry, as well as just being an easy way to pull together a list. But it's hard for me to feel like critical consensus aggregated in that way is enough to deem something a classic.
Right.
Especially because for several of these Metacritic things, the ratings from the players, and granted, of course, I have in some ways less trust of this, but in some ways, isn't it more important that we're thinking about what the general public thinks in some ways? The ratings from the players are substantially lower.
Right. I mean, I was thinking about it a little bit, and I really think that a classic has to be somewhat all-around successful before it can be considered a classic, though. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you end up sticking, like, a modifier in front of it, right? Like cult classic or critical classic or something like that. Like, it has to be reasonably financially successful, critics have to like it an amount, and the general public has to like it an amount. Otherwise, it just doesn't catch on the same way.
Yeah. I think you might also potentially add in the element of this has to be a little bit punny, game-changing in some way. Mm-hmm. It either needs to really break new ground of some kind of new mechanic or new idea or new perspective, new something, right? Mm-hmm. Or it needs to really refine or master or become the kind of defining example of some element.
Right.
You want to have some of that, like you were saying, historical significance. Even if that's mostly covered by the fact, like, oh, it sold 10 million copies, right?
Right.
At that point, it becomes historically significant just because it's become sort of part of at least some segment of the public consciousness.
The collective unconscious.
That's literally not what I said.
Deep down, we all love Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time.
It's in the cultural atmosphere. There's nothing you can do. You have to love it. It's got a 99 on Metacritic. But I think that in some ways, it's still kind of vague. It'd still be hard to define a game as a classic based on this. But yeah, I think saying it had some level of financial success. Although, that's the one that I feel like maybe I feel less strongly about than the others. Maybe you could help me with this. I don't feel like there are that many examples of this in the video game classic canon. But in that same Giant Bomb forum that I was reading, somebody mentioned, are there any video games that are like Blade Runner, right? Which everybody hated when it was released, but now is considered a sci-fi classic. Mm-hmm. And the best one I could think of was all those I almost said stupid. I haven't played them. I just how good could they be? But like the Mother, all that. I'm not trying to disparage it. It just keeps coming out of my mouth. All of that stuff of these kinds of, and it still probably is only fair to call those cult classics. But at the same time, Earthbound hit 30 on a very mainstream list of greatest video games of all time. So that's got to count for something.
Yeah.
Could you think of any games that were panned and then were looked back on as being this is great?
No Man's Sky.
That's because they've changed it, though.
Fair enough, yeah.
Right? That's not the same game.
Yeah. No.
Do you think that's even really possible in games?
Yes, it's possible with anything.
Okay, thanks, sure. I just mean that because the technology changes at such a fast rate that even if there was a game that was going to have that happen to it, no one is going to go back and play it, right?
Yeah. That's what the whole remaster thing is for, though, right? Sometimes there's unexpected games that get remastered, and suddenly everybody's like, "Oh man, I loved that game,"
That doesn't happen very often, though. To get a remaster, there has to be at least someone who thought it was good.
Sure, but that's the case with any game.
Yeah. I know. I meant to say that on a wider scale. That to get a remaster, usually it has to be something that's already considered at least a minor classic in some way, because otherwise, why would they remaster it?
I guess so. I mean, I don't know. There's weird games that get remastered, just because everything gets remastered now.
Fair enough.
Oh, this is sort of like a, not really example, but there's like Deadly Premonition. We've mentioned that game before.
I've heard of it.
So Deadly Premonition is like a very weird game that when it came out, like, it was like glitchy as all heck. But at the same time, it's like an open world where everybody has set schedules and everything. You play as like this FBI agent who like talks to somebody in his head that's probably the player. And there's like some Twin Peaksy type crap going on. And that's more of like a you really love it, you really hate it kind of game.
Sure.
But, like at the last Direct, they dropped a remaster of it on the Switch and announced the sequel. And it's like, I don't know, like 10 years old now. So really, anything can get a remaster.
That's fair, but I feel like usually with those kinds of games, it's like, we're gonna give it a sequel, and that's gonna be the pinnacle of it.
I guess so.
As opposed to, we're gonna go back and do this.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that nowadays, like, as you're assessing things as, like, a marketing person or a person, like, planning a company's future, like, you really you're thinking about, like, what will people talk about the most?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if there's some game that has a small community of people who are very passionate about it, and you're like, oh, so let's say we release a remaster, this small community will do nothing but tweet about it.
Yeah.
Until it comes out. And then if all they're doing is tweeting about it, people who are outside those circles will see those tweets and be like, oh, what's that? And they'll look into it, and then maybe they'll catch on with them, and then it'll spread like that.
Definitely.
Right, so there is some sort of... So even something that was widely either ignored or disliked, as long as there's a small community that is passionate about it, there is some value, or at least some tactical risk-reward gambling to be done on reviving it.
So how long until we get a Mother collection on the Switch?
They're never going to bring Mother 3 to the West. Because Nintendo's stupid.
Everyone would tweet about it.
I know, right? That's what I'm saying. What's wrong with you, Nintendo?
I can't believe you're one of them.
You don't have to do anything to it. All you have to be like, oh, by the way, here's Mother 3. And it's just easy money.
Just say, it's on Switch Online.
No, you sell it for $60.
No, I know, you're right.
Nobody wants Switch Online. Yeah, Nintendo, like, sometimes is a combination of, like, really smart and, like, totally unaware. They just, like, teeter back and forth between those two positions as a company.
Do you think for something to be a classic, it has to have transcended its games in some way? Like, I'm thinking Nintendo...
What?
Sorry, that was really vague. I'm thinking, like, Nintendo, for example, has all of these franchises that, you know, are always all over these lists, right? Like Mario,
right,
and Legend of Zelda, and Kirby even, and what other... Pokemon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of those guys have kind of, like, gone beyond their games and become part of, again, the collective unconscious. Do you think that like, is there, like, a different tier of classic for games that everybody knows about?
I mean, sure. I mean, the thing with Nintendo is they have very iconic characters. I mean that in, like, the sort of technical definition of it. Like, they're very simple to look at and therefore easy to remember. Right? Like, Kirby is just a pink blob. Nintendo's just, Mario is just a man in red with a mustache.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're very easy to pick up on. Like, Link is probably the most complicated of those types of characters in terms of design.
You mean
but even
Zelda?
then, like...
Just
yes,
kidding.
I mean Zelda. No, but even then, like, he's one... Except for Breath of the Wild, he's, like, one primary color.
Yeah.
Right? He's just green. He's the green boy. So those are, like... If you see them at all, those are very easy to remember. As opposed to, like... some of Final Fantasy is like that in some ways too. I would say that Cloud is pretty iconic looking.
Yeah. I would say if you've made it to Super Smash,
yeah,
you're pretty iconic.
Or you're a Fire Emblem protagonist.
Rude.
What was I going to say? I was going to say, like, The Last of Us, for instance. Like, they're not very iconic looking. They just look like human beings. So that's not necessarily, like, if you don't play games, you're not going to look at Ellie and be like, huh, that looks familiar. You're just going to be like, who's that girl?
Sure.
So that has more to do with that, I think.
Fair enough.
Like, obviously those games are big, whatever, right? Like, I'm not minimizing it, but I think that they catch on in the public consciousness because they're easy to remember by looking at them.
No, that makes sense.
So that might be something... I mean, that's a good thing, right? In some ways, you want your characters to be easy to remember and identify. But I think it's a little bit separate from being a classic.
I think that's fair. All right, one more question to throw out there. Can a game be an instant classic?
No.
Why not?
Because I think that classic does have a little bit to do with significance. I think that term involves not just a quality of a game, but, like, how significant it is. So, like, something I was thinking about is, like, when I was thinking about timelessness, is, like, I would go back to the old Legend of Zeldas more than I would go back to Pokemon Go. Like, Pokemon Go... Maybe this is a little different, because I would say... Anybody who played Pokemon Go, like, it was everywhere. It was all over things, right?
Yeah.
And I guess it is historically significant. This is sort of going against my point a little bit, but it's not a classic. So I think you have to wait. Basically what I'm trying to say is you have to wait for time a little bit. Like, how much does it stick around in conversations? And how much do people play it after the fact, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, in 2 years, who is going to be playing Pokemon Go? Just the small Pokemon Go community.
To be fair, the small Pokemon Go community is still a very large number of people.
Sure.
That's something I do.
I guess, and maybe there's still time to assess on that, but, like, besides Pokemon Go, what AR game has now, like, how many people are making AR games?
The Harry Potter
Just
one.
That's the same company.
Sure. That's fair.
So it hasn't really done anything to gaming. It was just
know.
sort of like a flashpoint.
I feel like I disagree. I feel like if there's a game in recent memory, I mean, there's some other ones that I might talk about, but one of the games that I would think of in recent memory might qualify as an instant classic. Or, I don't know, maybe I'm conflating historical significance. But Pokemon Go really was doing something that no one had done before. And having people approach gaming in a way that not much had done before. And getting a lot of people on board.
But there was there's no follow-through from that.
I guess.
Like, there's the Pokemon Go community, but how is that touching anything outside of that?
Lots of Twitter memes about how that was the only time this world knew peace.
That's not the same thing. That's all I'm saying, is that, like, I think it's important that a classic game be somewhat influential in some way.
I think that's hard to... I mean, maybe this is what goes against the idea of it being an instant classic, but I think especially with something like Pokemon Go, that's operating with technology that's still in kind of the nascent stage, it's a little hard to judge.
Exactly. So that's why
that's exactly...
instant classic.
You're right. I mean, you're right there that maybe it would be wrong to... I think it's an instant historical significance.
Fine, sure.
Because, I mean, that was a moment of, like, an explosion of gaming among people who would not identify as gamers, and people gaming in ways and in public that they haven't before.
But how historically significant does that become if you can't then trace something from it? And I'm not saying... I don't know if we have put enough distance to be able to trace something from it. But, like, if something happens, and then it's just that, nobody runs with it, is that historically significant, or is that just a historical event?
I think you would be wrong to not call Pokemon Go historically significant.
Okay, you can write me a research paper on why it is.
I'm getting roasted here, but
I'm just saying, and, like, I'm willing to admit that maybe this was not a great example, and that there's not enough distance between that to really judge anything. But that was part of the point of why something can't be an instant classic anyway.
Okay, so fine. So I think looking at that as an instant classic is...
Hey,
go ahead. Turn off my mic.
But I think to be historically significant, it has to have affected other areas. It has to have carried over into something. And I don't know that I could say that I could clearly say that has done something yet.
Okay, so what about, like... Oh, I can't believe I'm going to talk about Breath of the Wild. What about Breath of the Wild? I think that one, I mean, it's more in the canon of sort of established gaming conventions, right? We might have more ability to assess its impact sooner, because we're not relying on people being able to use this sort of new AR technology, right?
Right.
It comes from a very long, from a decades-long lineage of games from which it substantially deviated, right, from anything that had been done in that before. I read some article at some point about how it became like the single game draw that pushed people to buy a Switch.
Sure. Because it was the only game on the Switch.
Okay, true. But that's fair. That's very real. But, like, it was enough of a draw that it could be the only game on the Switch, and people wanted to buy it just for that.
Okay. Is there a question in here?
Could that be an instant classic?
I just think that you have to put more distance between something before you can call it a classic.
So we're 2 years out now.
Sure.
Open world is, if anything, even more prevalent.
Okay, but the Breath of the Wild came out already after a whole bunch of games had done open worlds.
I know.
That's not a new thing. It was just a new thing for this series.
Fair enough.
People were like, oh god, Nintendo can change? Wow.
I'm trying to think of... Or even, like, what about things that just, like, shatter sales records right away?
You just talked about this.
Ah!
Like, he's just said that you'd be laughed out of the room for putting Endgame at the top of any movie list.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, can games be instant greatest of all time, then?
No, because I think it's far more common, we were talking about this before, it's far more common for something to become disliked after being liked a lot than it is for something to become liked after being disliked a lot, especially in the modern age.
Okay. So in your theory, we probably shouldn't be considering a game for any of these greatest of all time lists until we've given it, a couple years? Yeah,
I mean, I don't know. Greatest of all time is just like a personal opinion. In my opinion. If you're using that term, you mean it as like, these are mine greatest of all time. Otherwise, I think that you're assessing classics.
That's sort of fair. Although it seems wrong that there's no way, I mean, not wrong, right? It's art. I couldn't tell you what the way is, but it does feel like there should be some way, at least within a given genre, to assess.
Sure, okay. Within a given genre. But I think that you have to be like, if I was making my greatest of all times list and it was just me, like, how many open world games would I put on there? Probably, like, I don't know, 0? Maybe 1, if I was feeling really generous. But, like, that's not fair, right? I'm objectively aware that people love Breath of the Wild and The Witcher 3 and all these sorts of games. And, like, it's just not for me. So it's very hard for one person to make this sort of objective list. And in that case, it's like... you know... I don't know what I was going to say. But, one person can't make an objective list, is what I'm saying. Because, even with, movies, how many horror movies would I put on there? 0. And, that's not true. It's just not. What was I how did I start with this? What was the beginning of this?
We were talking about how one person can't make a greatest of all time list.
No, before that. Why did I start talking?
I was talking about, can a game be instant greatest of all time? We said we had to wait a couple years. You were talking about how there would be no open world games on your list.
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying that if you're looking for something that's more objective, with big air quotes, that's like a classic list. Greatest of all time, when I'm looking at a list of greatest of all time, I just sort of assume it's just the writer's opinion.
Well, doesn't it feel like, though, doesn't it feel like greatest of all time list should be dominated by games from the last couple of years? We're pretty young, but my favorite games are pretty much dominated by games from the last couple of years. But it just feels like it should be that way, right? In a medium where so much of the improvement is happening on a technological level at this point, it would seem wrong if your greatest of all time list, like many of these greatest of all time lists, are dominated by games from the 80s.
Yeah.
To say we haven't bested these games, you're just bowing to their historical significance when you put those in your... I'm not saying some of them don't belong there, but I'm saying you're really saying that the original Legend of Zelda is better than any Legend of Zelda that has come since then. Stop. You're lying to yourself and to me.
Yeah. And that's why I guess that I would say that a list of most classic video games would be more appropriate for putting a more greater variety of games.
Well, in conclusion, Tetris is the greatest game of all time.
Oh man, I wish we could have gotten into the ROM stuff and remakes and remasters more, but we do not have time.
We'll save it for another episode.
Yeah,
that's a whole episode of its own.
Yeah. Next week we're talking about some games.
I really thought you launched into it so confidently. I was like, man, Emma knows.
I thought if I said it confidently, it would just sort of come to me as I spoke, just sort of make it real that way. We were Panzer Dragoon and Anthem. That's what we're talking about.
Right, Anthem.
Anthem does not make a classic nor a greatest of all time list.
Maybe historically significant.
Historically depressing. As for Panzer Dragoon, we have to do research. We'll see if it belongs or not.
Well, folks, to wrap things up, do you agree with our definition of classics and greatest of all time and how we might define that?
Did we even come up with a definition?
Not really. Well, we did a little. We talked about sort of elements that might go into it.
Uh-huh.
It's all a little wishy-washy in the, classic determining how do we value art world. Don't even get me started. I could talk for another several hours. But do you feel like there is something we missed in how to account for a game that's a classic or a game that's a GOAT in a term that Emma hates.
Oh, God, I hate that term.
Is Goat Simulator the GOAT?
Probably.
Or is Tetris? Do you have a compelling argument for why Tetris should be at the top of these lists? Or do you have games that you think are classics that we didn't talk about, or that you think are greatest of all times that we didn't talk about? All these things, we'd love to hear about them, and one way you can tell them about us, yikes, please don't tell Tetris about us, they're going to throw blocks at me, tell us about them, is to follow us and tweet or Instagram DM or message us on social media. As I sort of just already spoiled, we're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Talk This Podcast, and we're also on YouTube at Talk This Sisters, where Emma has talked about many games that I would consider to be modern classics.
One day we will return to the YouTube.
It's been a busy several months.
It really has.
For both of us. So the YouTube, there's stuff germinating there. You should continue to follow it.
Yeah.
There's lots of videos that no doubt you have not watched.
Yes.
So watch them.
Yes.
But you should also check out our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can see the games that are in the hat so that you can know which games Emma and I will forget in another 2 weeks' time. You can also see our blog, where you can follow the long-running series Clickbait Boyfriend, where my boyfriend is playing through Kingdom Hearts 3. It's finally coming back this week, people. And Split Screen, where Emma and I still need to finish Boys Over Flowers and My Hero Academia.
Split Screen should be coming back this week, too.
We're still soliciting suggestions for our pairing with My Hero Academia.
We really have to decide that.
I'm thinking we might do a buffer week with 2 My Heroes, just because we've started watching season 3 here, and...
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Last time I talked to him, he was like, I can't do it. And now he has given in.
Yeah. It took a lot of willpower yesterday to not just watch straight through.
Did you already catch up to where we are?
No.
Okay.
No. Anyway, we'll talk about that after the show is over. But finally, if you never want to miss an episode and you want to hear us talk about those games that one of them's Anthem, one of them's one that has a complicated name that I have not committed to memory yet.
Panzer Dragoon,
you should subscribe to the show. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Overcast, Pandora Podcasts on the app. Anywhere podcasts can be found, you can find Talk This. So subscribe, leave us a rating and review, and share all over your social media all about your favorite video game podcast.
Heck yeah.
So that's all I've got. Thanks for tuning in this week, folks. Emma, do you want to give them one of our classic goodbye zingers?
Well, I hope this week is the greatest of all time.
You'll only be able to tell in a couple of years, though.
Yes.